In the Gazette of July 1804, it appeared that Robert Blakeney, gentleman, was appointed to an ensigncy in the 28th Regiment of Infantry. Relying on the delusive promise that zeal would meet certain reward, I immediately joined my regiment near Cork, where they lay encamped, forming part of a corps under command of Sir Eyre Coote. On the second day after my joining, the whole of the troops marched to Kinsale, and having taken up a position on some high ground looking down on the bay, the men commenced firing ball with as much anxiety as if the whole French flotilla, filled with ruthless invaders and headed by Napoleon in person, were attempting a landing underneath. Some seagulls were seen to fall, and it was confidently reported that many others were wounded. As soon as the fight was over, the men sat down to dine with all those proud feelings which soldiers are wont to entertain after a victory. Never shall I forget the thrilling emotion which agitated my whole frame at seeing the blood fall from the hand of one of the soldiers, wounded through the clumsy manner in which he fixed his flint. I eyed each precious drop that fell with glowing sensations, such as would blaze in the breast of a Napoleon on beholding an old dynasty diadem, or inflame the heart of a Scot in contemplating a new place in the treasury. I now became on the effective strength of the 1st Battalion, which I joined the next year. Both battalions of the regiment were removed to Parsonstown, and thence proceeded to the Curragh of Kildare, where 20,000 men were encamped under the command of Lord Cathcart. Second lieutenants were now given to all 1st Battalion companies, so that immediately on our arrival here, the 3 senior ensigns of the regiment, Robert Johnson, Robert Blakeney and Charles Cadell, were promoted, and thus I again joined the 2nd Battalion in camp. On the breaking up of this encampment, the 2 battalions of the regiment were separated. The first proceeded to Mallow and thence to Monkstown, where they shortly after embarked for Germany in the expedition commanded by the above-mentioned nobleman. The 2nd Battalion, to which I now again belonged, were ordered to do garrison duty in Dublin. In the December of this year, being ordered to proceed to Exeter on the recruiting service, I embarked on board the mercantile brig Britannia, Captain Burrows, bound from Dublin to Bristol, and a more ignorant drunken lubber never commanded a vessel. The wind, which might be considered a fresh breeze at leaving the port, blew hard as we entered the Bristol Channel, when our ignorant master nearly ran us foul of Lundy Island, which more through good luck than able seamanship we fortunately weathered. As we proceeded, the gale became tremendous. The billows rolled in majestic, yet horrific grandeur over our heads, sweeping everything off deck, and then the master, far from encouraging the crew, and by good example inspiring them with a due sense of the duty which they had to perform, added to their terror and dispirited all by his degrading and worse than useless lamentation, calling aloud on his wife and children, then in Bristol. An attempt was made to run the vessel into the small port of Ilfracombe, but this failed through the ignorance and terror of the master. Still impetuously driven forward, we approached the small village of Combe-Martin, when a loud crash was heard, caused, if I recollect right, by striking against a sandbank, and then the captain, in his usual consolatory language, cried out that all was lost, and every soul on board must perish. A gentleman passenger now came down to the cabin, and, vainly endeavouring to restrain his unwilling yet manly tears, embraced his wife and 2 young children, who lay helpless in one of the berths. The innocent little babes clung round his neck, beseeching him to take their mamma and them on shore. He endeavoured to soothe their grief, but that which he considered it to be his painful duty to impart was most heartrending. He recommended them and his wife to remain tranquil in their berths, saying that it was totally useless to attempt going on deck, for all hope was lost, and that they should turn all their thoughts to heaven alone. The scene was excessively affecting, and acted, I confess, more powerfully on my feelings than all the dangers with which we were surrounded. For although I had lain the whole time in my berth, so overpowered with seasickness as to be incapable of any exertion. I now started up and hurried on deck just as the brutal drunken skipper was knocked down by a blow from the tiller whilst trying to direct it. Urged by the impulse of the moment, I seized the abandoned tiller and moved it in the direction which I saw the late occupant attempt. At this critical moment, we descried a person on horseback making signals. This gentleman, having witnessed our failure to enter Ilfracombe, and foreseeing our inevitable destruction should we be driven past Combe rode at full speed along the shore, waving his hat sometimes in one direction, sometimes in another. Assisted by one of the passengers, I think a Mr. Bunbury, all the sailors were now drunk, I moved the tiller in conformity with the signals made by the gentleman on shore, and in a short time we succeeded in guiding the vessel through a very intricate and narrow passage between rocks and banks, and finally ran her aground on a shoal of sand. The storm still continuing to blow furiously, the vessel beat violently from side to side against the sandbanks. But some men having contrived to come off from the village, to which we were now close, and fastening ropes to the mast, bound her fast down on one side, when the whole crew got safe to land. We subsequently learned that 8 vessels were that morning wrecked in the Bristol Channel. It must be allowed that much credit was due to the fishermen of Combe for the alacrity they showed in giving us their assistance, but it must also be confessed that while we remained for a few hours in the village, they appeared to be the rudest and most uncouth people I ever met with in Great Britain. Every man in the village claimed to be the first who came to assist us, and as such demanded a suitable reward. Much of our luggage disappeared in being removed from the vessel to the shore, and was heard of no more. The greater part of my own goods, through my own ignorance of voyaging and the carelessness and inattention of the master being left exposed on deck, was washed away during the storm. But what money I possessed was luckily hoarded up in my trousers pocket, and in truth, my trousers were the only part of my dress I had on during the whole time I was on deck, assuming the functions of pilot and captain, the skipper being in a state of torpidity from fright and drunkenness. As soon as we could procure means of transport, which took some hours, we proceeded to Ilfracombe, for Combe was incapable of affording accommodation for so large a party. Credit was given to me for having saved the crew, but I took none to myself. It was the first time I had ever been on board of any vessel larger than an open fishing boat, and I was consequently as ignorant of steering a ship as of training an elephant. Any part I took, therefore, was perfectly mechanical, and the inventive and true merit was solely due to the gentleman on shore, by whose directions I was guided. Being subservient to the will of another, I could have as little claim to credit for judgment or plan, principle or reflection, as could a wine-wagged billy punch or a tail voter in the House. Next morning, I proceeded to Exeter, but previous to my departure, my attention was called to 2 Dublin ladies, fellow passengers, who, being bound direct for Bristol, were not prepared to meet the expenses of a land journey thither. They appeared much distressed in mind, and declared they would rather die than leave any part of their luggage in pledge. I lent them a few guineas out of my own small stock, upon which they took my address, promising to remit the money as soon as they arrived at Bristol. But, gaining experience as I advanced, I found that I should have taken their address, for I never after heard of or from them. After having remained some months in Devonshire on the recruiting service, I was ordered to join the 1st Battalion of the regiment, then quartered at Colchester, after their return from the fruitless expedition into Germany. We did not long remain here. On July 24th of the next year, the regiment marched from Colchester to Harwich, and there embarked to join a 2nd expedition, commanded by Lord Cathcart. So profoundly was our destination kept secret, and so ignorant were we all of the object in view, that we could not even conjecture whither we were going, until on August 8th we arrived in the Sound and anchored late that night close under Elsinore Castle, during the loudest storm of thunder, accompanied by the most brilliant lightning I ever witnessed. At intervals, the immense fleet, consisting of men of war, transports and merchantmen, the islands of Zealand, the extent of the Sound, together with the opposite Swedish coast, as if suddenly emerged from darkest chaos, instantly became more visible than if lighted by the noonday sun in all his splendor. These astonishing elemental crashes and dazzling shows were as suddenly succeeded by death-like silence and darkness so impenetrable that not an individual could be distinguished even by those who stood nearest on deck. Yet, although the ground of the night was perfectly dark still, guided by the vivid flashes with which it was relieved, every vessel of this apparently unwieldy fleet fell into her proper berth and, duly measuring the appropriate length of cable, swung securely to her anchor, and, strange to say, not a single casualty took place through the whole. The scene altogether was excessively grand, and truly presented what in hackneyed poetic phrase is termed sublime. The jarring elements seemed to portend evil to the descendants of Odin, nor were there wanting some with evil eye who foreboded something rotten in the state of Denmark. For some days the most friendly intercourse was maintained between the inhabitants and the British officers. Parties from the fleet landed daily, were hospitably received, and both liberally and cheerfully provided with all such articles as could contribute to their comfort. No suspicion of our hostile intentions was even conjectured by the deluded Danes. At length, the true object of our designs being suspected, a Danish frigate which lay near us slipped her cable on the night of the 13th and contrived to get away in the dark. But on her escape being discovered at daybreak, the Comus sloop of war was sent in pursuit. Since it was a dead calm, she was towed out by the boats of the fleet. The scene is still fresh in my memory, and I fancy that I see the long line of boats manfully urged forward, our brave jolly tars, after every 2 or 3 strokes of the oars, crying out, "Hurrah! Hurrah! For the Danish black frigate!" At length, the Comus came up with her in the Kattegat on her way to Norway, and after a short conflict, brought her back a prize into her own port, and this hostile act put an end to all further intercourse on friendly terms. Some English boats which approached the shore next morning were fired at, and none were thenceforward allowed to land. On the 15th, we dropped down to Humlebeck, a village about 7 miles distant from Copenhagen, and on the following day, covered by 17 ships of the line, a proportionate number of frigates, gunboats, etc., commanded by Admiral Gambier, the military commanded by Lord Cathcart, landed with fire and sword, upon ground suddenly considered hostile. No previous intimation of intended hostility was given, as is customary amongst all civilized nations when real injuries have been suffered or imaginary ones held forth as a pretext for political aggression. At this village, Humlebeck, it was that 107 years previous to this, our attack the Alexander of the North landed from the King Charles, the largest ship then known to the waves and carrying 120 guns. Here it was that this extraordinary man heard for the first time the whistling of bullets. Ignorant of the cause, he asked General Stuart by whom he was accompanied, and the general with characteristic frankness answered, "It is the whistling of bullets fired at your Majesty." "Good," replied the warlike young monarch. "Henceforth it shall be my music." But how different were the motives which urged the hostile descent in 1700 from those which inspired our attack in 1807, as different as was the beardless Charles, not yet 18, in the bloom of youth, with the fiery martial genius which soon made him the terror of Europe, and burning with anger at national aggression and personal insult, from our leader, who was already descending into the vale of years, and who could have felt no greater stimulus than military discipline in strictly obeying orders which he probably disapproved. Military excitement there was none. On our landing, no whistling bullets greeted the veteran's ear, nor inspired the young soldier to deeds of deathless glory. Laurels there were none to reap, for the defence of the capital depended principally on undisciplined militia and young students at college. To add still further to the contrast, the Swedes landed as open and declared foes, whereas we, coming with no less hostile intent, professed ourselves bosom friends. On the night of our landing, August 16th, we advanced through a lofty forest. During our march, an alarm was given that the foe were approaching. Orders were instantly issued to load with ball and fix bayonets, when many a sleek-chinned boy lost or gained the flush on his cheek. I now forget in which class I ranked, as with many others present, it was the first time I expected to come in contact with a national foe, for such the Danes were some few hours before declared. The alarm proved false, and we felt grievously disappointed or happily consoled, according to the feelings of the individual. Next morning, we continued our march towards the capital, but ere we reached the immediate vicinity of Copenhagen, our march was interrupted by an occurrence not ordinary in warfare. A dense column of dust proclaimed the advance of some large body, which we naturally considered to be hostile. Horsemen were soon discovered, when we immediately formed in battle array, but we soon learned that the approaching foe were no other than a civic cavalcade, who escorted the royal princesses of Denmark to a place of safety, having been by special permission allowed to retire from the scene of premeditated slaughter. The royal carriages slowly advanced, accompanied by many of the principal nobility of Denmark, and attended by a small escort of dragoons. The unfortunate princesses wept bitterly, as did many of the nobles who were with them. In witnessing their grief, it was impossible to remain unmoved. The whole appeared a sorrowful funeral procession, although all were living bodies. As the royal mourners passed between our hostile ranks, arms were presented, colours dropped, and bands played the national anthem, God Save the King, thus adding to the poignancy of their woe by vain pageant and heartless courtesy. This distressing ceremony being ended, we pushed forward, and, having arrived before the destined town, each corps took up their proper position. Our station was near the village of Frederiksborg, in a wheat field whose golden ears overtopped the tallest grenadier. The stems we trampled down for bedding, giving the grain to our sumpter animals. This being the first time I ever adventured from the shores of Great Britain, everything was new to me and consequently enjoyed. I saw the first Congreve rockets ever fired against an enemy. They seemed reluctant to add to the conflagration, many of them in the midst of their orbit turning back to whence they were sped. I witnessed the fall of the lofty and majestic steeple, bearing the 3 crowns, awfully tumbling down among the blazing ruins. The loud and tremendous crash, heard for miles around, was terrific, and it must have been a heart-rending spectacle to the proud and patriotic Danes who witnessed the destruction of such a noble monument of national grandeur. Immediately after the deafening crash, still growling in the distance, suddenly there arose an immense body of fire, which, detaching itself from the ruins, illuminated the whole island, blazing in spiral form towards the heavens, as if to demand retribution. I saw well the splendour of the scene, being that night an outlying piquet with Captain, now Sir Frederick, stove in. In the meantime, the inhabitants were most liberally served with shells, shot, and rockets. While the siege was thus actively carried forward, a report was made that some Danish troops, so-called, had occupied in hostile array an eminence in our immediate vicinity. a detachment were immediately sent against them, of which one wing of the 28th Regiment formed a part, and in this wing I was a feather. On our arrival at the base of this eminence, we did actually discover a confused multitude congregated on the summit, but upon our preparing to charge, they instantly took flight. The affair, although of no consequence, was not unattended with trophies. On the ground occupied by the discomfited Danes were found many old, rusty sword blades and very many pairs of wooden shoes, with which the Danish troops were loosely shod. For becoming nervous at the threatened charge, they freed themselves from those encumbrances and fled in light marching order, determined, if closely pursued, rather to attempt swimming across the belt than carry further their cumbrous pontoons. The proud victors returned to the trenches. For what took place in the interior of the island, since I was not there, I will refer the curious to the dispatches written home on the occasion, wherein these skirmishes or manoeuvres, if I recollect right, are in glowing language fully detailed. All our batteries, constructed generally in the most beautiful and highly cultivated gardens belonging to the nobility and wealthy citizens of Copenhagen, opened their fire on September 1st, which with but little intermission continued until the 6th. On the 7th, when about to be stormed, the capital surrendered, after having 400 houses, several churches, and many other splendid buildings destroyed, and 1,100 inhabitants of all ages and sexes killed. As soon as the first paroxysms of furious excitement, wild despair, and just indignation of the unfortunate inhabitants had somewhat abated, a certain number of officers from each regiment, with written passports, were permitted to visit the still smoking city. The spectacle was lamentable and well calculated to rouse every feeling of sympathy. Many houses were still smouldering and in part crumbled to the ground. Mothers were bewailing the melancholy fate of their slaughtered children, and there was not one but deplored the loss of some fondly beloved relative or dearly valued friend. Yet they received us with dignified, though cool courtesy, in part suppressing that horror and antipathy which they must have felt at our presence, though some indeed exclaimed that their sufferings were the more aggravated as being inflicted contrary to the laws of all civilized nations. The unfortunate sufferers seemed not to reflect that war was will, not law. In less than 6 weeks after the fall of Copenhagen, which time was occupied in rendering the Danish ship seaworthy and spoiling its well-stored arsenal to the last nail and minutest rope yarn, we departed, carrying away with us, as prizes, 18 sail of the line, 15 frigates, 5 brigs, and 20 gunboats. It would be useless to enter into further detail on this painful subject. The partial conflagration of the Danish capital and the rape of her fleet by her friends the British are already too well known throughout Europe, as well as the reasons adduced in vindication, namely precaution, surely a most unjustifiable policy. The great Aristides, characteristically called the just, would have spurned the proposal of such ignoble policy, as may be seen by his celebrated reply to the treacherous proposition of Themistocles to burn the fleet of their allies. Aristides, being deputed by the assembly to ascertain the proposition of Themistocles, who would deliver it only in secret, on his return declared that nothing could tend more to the advantage of Athens than the proposition of Themistocles, nor could anything be more unjust. The high-spirited people of Athens, indignant that a proposition of such nature should be mooted, rejected it with contempt, not deigning even to listen to its import. The descent on Copenhagen was a flagrant outrage of that divine precept which inculcates that which is morally wrong can never be politically right. Everything being now in readiness which we could carry away, we departed from the shores of Denmark in the latter end of October, and after a most boisterous passage, in which all the gunboats perished at sea, We arrived in England towards the latter end of November. The 28th Regiment landed at Portsmouth, and a few days later marched for Colchester. Here we occupied our old barracks in little more than 4 months from the period of our departure thence for foreign service. But within that short time, how wonderfully did we add to the notoriety of Great Britain! It was facetiously said that the British expeditions sent forth at this time were like the drunken Irishman at Donnybrook Fair, intent on fight but devoid of plan, who meets his friend and knocks him down for love. A few months after my return, it being confidently supposed that the regiment would now remain for some time at home, I procured leave of absence to visit my friends in Ireland, but shortly after my departure, the regiment received orders in April to embark at Harwich and join the expedition under Sir John Moore. I was immediately recalled, but on my arrival in London, I found that the army had sailed already for Sweden. I procured a passage to follow the expedition on board the Fury bomb. Here I cannot say that I felt comfortable. It was the first time I had the honour of sailing in a man of war. There were many ceremonies to be observed of which I was ignorant, and the close observance of these was attended with some annoyance to a novice. As usual, I suffered severely from seasickness, which at times induced me to sit on a gun or relieve my aching head against the capstan. And this, I was given to understand, was a royal naval innovation which could not be tolerated. Although Captain Gibson, who commanded, was very polite and frequently entertained me with anecdotes of himself and of a namesake and relative of mine, whom he stated to be his most intimate friend and brother officer, still, the only place I could procure to sleep on was a trunk immediately under the purser's hammock. Even this luxury I was denied in daytime, for everything being cleared away at an early hour, I was compelled to quit my roost at cockcrow in the morning. It not unfrequently happened, too, that running up on deck, urged by a sick stomach, I forgot the ceremony of saluting the quarter-deck, and the omission was always followed by reproof. Although a strict observance of these regulations was rather teasing to me in my irritated state of mind and body, yet I feel perfectly aware of its expediency on board a man of war. Having at length anchored in Gothenburg harbour, I descended from the noble punctilious man of war and was lowered into the humble transport, where I found ad libitum seasickness a luxury compared to the restraint which I had lately undergone. I now doubly enjoyed the society of my old comrades. By these I was informed that on the arrival of the expedition at Gothenburg, which took place a few days previously, the troops were refused permission to land. About this period, although the British troops were sent to all parts as friends, yet unfortunately they were everywhere viewed with distrust, and a strict watch kept on all their movements. The prohibition to land his troops being totally contrary to the expectations of Sir John Moore, he immediately proceeded to Stockholm to demand explanation of this extraordinary conduct on the part of Sweden, and also to seek instructions, having, as it would appear, received none at home. In an interview with His Swedish Majesty, the British general declined to accept some extraordinary propositions matured in the quixotic brain of that inconsistent monarch. The first was that Sir John Moore, with his 10,000 British troops, should conquer the kingdom of Denmark. The second, that a similar attempt should be made with like means on the Russian Empire. Finally, as Sir John Moore peremptorily refused to shut up the British army in the fortress of Stralsund, then about to be invested by an overwhelming French army, he was placed under arrest by the king. In the meantime, we were actively employed in practicing landings from the flat-bottomed boats, as if in the face of an enemy, and scampering over the rocks to keep the men in exercise. This salubrious mode of warfare continued without intermission until Sir John Moore contrived to have secret information conveyed to the army, when we immediately dropped down out of reach of the Swedish batteries, and shortly afterwards, having eluded the vigilance of Gustavus, to the great joy of all, On June 29th, our gallant chief arrived safe on board the fleet. Setting sail for England on July 2nd, we arrived off Yarmouth about the middle of the month. Here, taking in water and fresh provisions, we continued our course for Spithead, and thence we took our second departure from England, this time for Portugal, the more delighted since we left our tales behind us. To the great joy of the whole army, an order arrived from the Horse Guards, while we lay at Spithead to cut off the men's queues. These, from their shape, and being generally soaped for effect, were called pigtails. Thenceforth, the custom of plastering the men's heads with soap was abolished in the British Army. Sailing from St. Helens on July 31st, 1808, August 19th, brought us close off the coast of Portugal. Next morning we commenced landing at Figueira, close to the mouth of the Mondego. A large part of the army were already on shore, and some of the troops had commenced moving forward, when Sir John Moore received a dispatch informing him that Sir Arthur Wellesley had fought and defeated the enemy at Rolica, and hourly expected a second engagement. The disembarkation was instantly countermanded. The troops on march were recalled and put on board as quickly as the high surf and rapidity of the current would permit. Everything again in sailing order, and every heart elate. We continued our course southward, now steering direct for the theatre of actual war, and the true martial spirit glowed in the breast of every true soldier. Imagine, then, what must have been our feelings on the following morning. August 21st, when in almost a dead calm we moved slowly along, apparently rendered more slow by our plainly hearing the heavy booming of cannon, at that moment pouring forth their fury from the heights of Vimiero. But they alone who have been in battle and cordially mingled in fight can sympathize with the feelings which thrill through every nerve and agitate the frame of those who, all but in reach of the field, yet are withheld from participating in its glory. Intense excitement painfully marked the veteran's contracted brow, while fiery impatience flashed in the eyes of the young soldiers. Creeping along the scarcely ruffled surface of the waters, like wounded snakes or Alexandrine verse, we, seemingly in so many years, arrived in 3 days in the unquiet bay or roadstead of Peniche. Here, although the distant sea continued calm, still the surf so dashed against the shore that we found much difficulty in landing. When this at last was done, we immediately proceeded to unite with Sir Arthur Wellesley's troops, whom we found still upon the ground, so late the theatre of their gallant exploits. This, our first march, although but of 3 leagues, was severely felt, since with the exception of a scramble over the rocks in the vicinity of Gothenburg harbour, we had been for upward of 4 months cooped up in miserable little transports. The men had scarcely the use of their limbs, and being so long unaccustomed to carry their packs, to which were now added 3 days' provisions and 60 rounds of ball cartridge, in this their first march, with the thermometer between 90 and 100, many were left behind and slowly followed after. The 4th or King's Own Regiment, with whom we were then brigaded, from its seniority of number, marched in front. Although at the time perhaps the finest-looking body of men in the army, the select of 3 battalions, yet, being generally rather advanced in age as soldiers and heavy-bodied, they were on this day continually falling out of the ranks and flanking the road. This afforded an opportunity to one of our light-hardy Irishmen, a class of which the 28th Regiment was then chiefly composed, to remark, "Faith, this is a very deceiving march. The royal milestones are so close to each other." Nor did the officers suffer less than the men. Being mostly very young, and with the exception of those who were at Copenhagen, where little or no marching took place, never having seen a shot fired, they were totally ignorant of the nature of a campaign. Means of transport being always very difficult to procure in Portugal and Spain, we all overloaded ourselves, carrying a boat cloak, in itself heavy, in which was rolled a partial change of dress. Our haversacks contained, as did the men's, 3 days' provisions, to which was added an extra pair of boots or shoes, and every gentleman carried a stout charge of rum on service when so fortunate as to be able to procure it. Each young warrior, too, hampered himself with a case of pistols and a liberal quantity of ball cartridge, and generally a heavy spyglass. Thus, heavily equipped, many of us commenced our first day's march in the Peninsula in the month of August, with thermometer at 95. However, before we proceeded much further in the campaign, a light cart was allowed to each regiment for the convenience of the officers, which by diminishing our loads wonderfully increased our comfort. We now fully expected to move rapidly forward against the foe, but slow and solemn marches were substituted. Nor could we account for this extraordinary inaction, although rumour was abroad that this, our first campaign in Portugal, was in honourable progress through the medium of foolscap and sheepskin. Still we plodded forward until we arrived at the plains of Queluz, about 5 miles distant from Lisbon, where we halted, and where our late sluggish movements were accounted for when we heard of the celebrated Convention of Cintra. By this the Muscovite fleet, which by all the laws of war we considered securely our own, were allowed triumphantly to depart from out the Tagus, with their national colours flying. And Junot, also with his troops and all their plunder, sacrilegiously carried off from holy temples or wrung from the helpless orphan or widow, and this ill-gotten freight was conveyed in British ships to the shores of our most inveterate foes. The 3 commanders-in-chief, with whom the more than anxious care of the ministry contemporaneously furnished the small army in Portugal, were recalled to England to account for their conduct or misconduct, one for having offended some part of the ministry by gaining a splendid victory, another for having offended his country by blasting the fruits of that victory, and the third for having done nothing but ratify a degrading convention, odious to all. It is scarcely necessary here to state that these high personages were, beginning with the junior, Sir Arthur Wellesley, Sir Harry Burrard, and Sir Hugh Dalrymple. A 4th commanding general was now appointed in the person of Sir John Moore, destined to lead the greater part of the British forces in Portugal against the enemy. Immediately upon this appointment, the greatest activity prevailed throughout every branch of the service. The new commander of the forces, although anxiously employed in forming magazines and depots and organizing the whole material of the army, yet appeared to be continually riding through our ranks or inspecting the different regiments. I recollect that the 28th Regiment were inspected the day following the one originally appointed, in consequence of the general not being able to attend. We stood 1,099 bayonets, officers and sergeants not included. Had we been inspected the previous day, we should have stood exactly 1,100 bayonets, but one man was sent to hospital the night previous. After the inspection was over, Sir John Moore called the captains and officers commanding companies together, whom he thus addressed. "Gentlemen, what I have to say to you is pleasant. I have never seen a body of men in finer order than your regiment. They appear more like the picture of a battalion than actual men bearing arms." Then, addressing Captain, now Colonel Sir Frederick, "Stovin," he said, "the fame of your grenadier company has gone through the army, but much as I expected from report, I am more pleased at its appearance than I could have anticipated." All arrangements being now in a state of forwardness, the army broke up the camp of Queluz about the middle of October, and following different routes and moving by regiments in succession, marched for Spain, and an army in better heart, finer condition, or more gallantly commanded were never produced by any nation upon earth. We, the 28th Regiment, marched on the 14th. I recollect the date well, being on that day appointed to the Light Company. To attempt to give a daily account of our march to Salamanca is beyond the scope of my memory. and even though I should be capable of so doing, it would be attended with little more interest than mentioning the names of the different towns and villages through which we passed or describing the houses in which we were lodged at night. We marched with the headquarters. On the route through Guarda, one battery of artillery accompanied us, whom Captain Wilmot commanded. They consisted of 6 light 6-pounders, and even these we had the greatest difficulty in getting through the pass of Villavelha. The first gun conveyed across had 2 drag ropes attached, and to resist its rapidity while being trailed downhill, these ropes were held by as many soldiers as the short and frequent turning of this zigzag descent would permit. Yet their resistance was scarcely sufficient to preserve the guns from rolling over the precipice. This in a great measure arose from Captain Wilmot having opposed locking any of the wheels, alleging that by so doing the carriages would suffer materially and consequently become unserviceable much sooner. Trailing the guns down in this manner was excessively laborious to the soldiers, and not unattended with danger. Several men who could not get clear of the ropes, on suddenly coming to the sharp turns, were absolutely dragged through the walls which flanked the road. The resistance necessary to check the velocity of even these light guns must have been very great, for I can attest that there was not one soldier of the 28th Light Company who had heels to his shoes after the drag. They were a good deal shaken and much dissatisfied, considering it a great hardship to have a pair of shoes destroyed in one day without being allowed any remuneration. Captain Wilmot, having witnessed the danger in which the first gun frequently was of being precipitated over the flanking wall and consequently lost, as well as the great risk to which the men were exposed, and being still unwilling to lock the wheels, determined to try the bed of the Tagus. In pursuance of this project, he had the horses of 2 or 3 guns harnessed to 1 gun at a time, and in this manner passed the remainder of the guns in succession across the stream, cheered by the whole of the men during the entire operation, which lasted a considerable time, and was, of course, attended with much fatigue and exertion. The guns during their passage were accompanied by a part of the soldiers to give what assistance lay in their power in case of meeting obstacles in the bed of the river. The horses were immersed above their bellies and the men up to their middles. Yet Captain Wilmot never quitted the stream, crossing and recrossing until all the guns were safely landed. The principal difficulty arose in drawing them up the opposite bank, but this being an affair of mere physical force, all obstacles were soon overcome. After this, our first check, we moved on cheerily, as is usual with soldiers who never dwell upon hardships a moment longer than their continuance. Our next great annoyance, and I may add suffering, was caused by the inclemency of the weather. On the day upon which we marched into Guarda, the 5th Regiment lost 5 men, and the 28th Regiment 2 men, who actually perished on the road in consequence of heavy rain, which incessantly fell during the whole day. A person who has never been out of England can scarcely imagine its violence. Let him fancy himself placed under a shower bath with the perforations unusually large, the water not propelled divergingly with a light sprinkling, but large globular drops pouring down vertically and descending in such rapid succession as to give the appearance rather of a torrent than a shower. He may then form an idea of the rainy season, which drenches Portugal during the autumnal months. Exposed to such rain, we marched many miles to gain the top of the hill upon which stands Guarda. Having at length performed this harassing march, the regiments, I think 3 in number, were lodged in large convents situated in the immediate suburbs, which had been prepared for our reception. Immense fires were soon lit, and the men commenced first wringing and then drying their clothing. Rations were delivered as soon as possible, and the glad tidings of a double allowance of rum loudly rang throughout the Holy Isles. The soldiers now began to forget what they had suffered during the day. The business of cooking went on cheerfully, but from the blazing fires which illumined the convent, much precaution was necessary to preserve the building from being burned. The men being made as comfortable as circumstances would permit, and there being no accommodation for the officers in the convent, they were as usual billeted upon private houses in the town, each regiment leaving an officer in the convent to preserve good order. For after hardship, as after victory, soldiers are prone to commit excesses. In walking through the town next day, but one, we halted there 2 days, I met the commander of the forces, accompanied by 2 of his staff and 1 orderly dragoon. He rode to and fro in the street several times, evidently in search of something. As I stood still, as if to ask if I could be of any use, Sir John Moore rode up and asked me if the men's clothes and appointments were yet dry. I replied that they were not perfectly so, but would be in the course of the day. He expressed his satisfaction, adding, "You must march tomorrow at all events. I shall not ask about your arms or ammunition. The 28th know their value too well to neglect them." He then said that his horse had just lost a shoe, for which he was in search. I also searched for a moment, but to no purpose. The general then remarking that no doubt he should find some place along the road to have his horse shod, rode away. I mention this trifling circumstance, otherwise uninteresting, because it illustrates Sir John Moore's constant habit of speaking to every officer of his army whom he met, whatever his rank, asking such questions as tended to elicit useful information, and in the most good-humoured and courteous manner, making such remarks as indirectly called forth the most strenuous endeavours of all to a full discharge of their duties. But when he considered a more direct interference requisite, he was prompt in showing it without partiality and regardless of persons. An instance of this took place a few days previous to our breaking up the camp at Queluz. On meeting an old officer, with whom he was long acquainted, and who was his countryman, he asked him familiarly how he did. The officer answered, in the manner which men in good health usually do, that he was perfectly well, and he added, "I am totally at your Excellency's service. I have nothing to do." He hinted perhaps that a staff employment would not be unacceptable nor injurious to the service. Sir John Moore politely bowed. Next day, commanding officers were called upon to use every exertion necessary to bring their regiments fully equipped into the field with as little delay as possible, and to see that every officer under their respective commands was employed with equal diligence as themselves, which he feared was not the case. For no later than the day before, a major of a regiment told him that he had nothing to do. He therefore held commanding officers responsible that the particular duties of every officer should be clearly and distinctly pointed out, and he added that this would forward the service and prevent discontent from want of employment. I was acquainted with the individual alluded to, a gallant officer who has since met the fate of a soldier in the field of glory. After 2 days' halt at Guarda, we continued our march without any other interruption than the falling waters, and having traversed Portugal, we on November 10th marched into Fuentes de Oñoro. This was the first Spanish town we entered, and here we halted for the night. Villaformosa, distant about 2 miles from Fuentes de Oñoro, is the nearest frontier town to Spain on that road. The 2 nations are here divided by a rivulet so inconsiderable that upon its being pointed out, many of us stood over it with 1 foot in Portugal and the other in Spain. But even if this national boundary had not been pointed out, we should have immediately discovered upon entering the town that we were no longer in Portugal. The difference was very striking and perceptible, even in the first Spanish glance which we encountered. During our march through Portugal, we mixed with people who in a manner looked up to us and showed rather a grovelling deference. We now encountered a nation whose inhabitants never regarded others as in any way superior to themselves. Their greatest condescension in meeting any other people was to consider them as equals, Superiority they denied to all. The Portuguese showed us the greatest hospitality and in the civilest manner. Yet their hospitality appeared the result of some obligation or constraint, not unmixed with gratitude. The Spaniards, though equally generous, were proudly hospitable. Their hospitality was sincere and not marked or rendered cold by ostentation. It appeared to be spontaneously offered as mere matter of course, unconnected with other sentiments, disdaining any consideration beyond the act itself. The Portuguese, in his conversation, studied more the smooth arrangement of his specious words than the laudable sentiments by which they should be dictated. He endeavoured by many a ludicrous gesture and grotesque posture to add that force to his subject which was wanting in matter. And whatever might be the result, he always retired fawningly. The Spaniard, invariably polite in his language and dignified in attitude, solely depended on the soundness of his argument, and talking looked you full in the face. His words clearly expressed his thoughts, and he felt hurt if obliged to repeat, and he concluded his discourse with a graceful inclination of his person. The Portuguese are not so fine or so handsome a race as the Spaniards, and in figure they are far inferior. The females have all black eyes, lamp-black if you please, but dim and dusky when compared to the brilliant black eyes of the Spanish fair. We passed the night at Fuentes de Oñoro with mingled feelings of annoyance and pleasure, annoyed at not being able to join the inhabitants in conversation, which in some degree we could do in Portugal. I felt quite in the background, for from what little of the Portuguese language I was enabled to pick up during the march, I had acted as a kind of regimental interpreter. Pleasure we experienced at the wonderful contrast between the people whom we had just quitted and our present hosts, entirely in favour of the latter. And although we did not understand their language, yet it fell so melodiously on the ear that I for one could never after suffer the Portuguese dialect. I remembered how Charles V said, or was reputed to have said, that whenever he wished to address his God, he always did so in the Spanish language. Next day we marched to Ciudad Rodrigo, or the city of Don Roderick, the last of the Visigoth monarchs who reigned in Spain. Here I was billeted at the house of an hidalgo or nobleman, who treated me most hospitably, and ordered my baggage pony to be put into his private stable. But the hatred which existed between the Spaniards and Portuguese seemed to prevail even among their animals, for my unfortunate horse was so kicked and maltreated that after endeavouring to carry my baggage to Es Martin del Rio, where we halted for the night, the poor animal dropped down, dead. Besides the inconvenience which his loss caused me, I regretted his death very much. I purchased him at Queluz near Lisbon, and he always followed me through the camp, keeping up with my pace like a dog. On our next day's march, we again had some work with the artillery. The bridge over the Huelva was too narrow for the guns. It was considered that too much time would be occupied in marching over it. Therefore, in courtesy, it was left for the baggage animals. As we had become partly amphibious by our aquatic march through Portugal, and being now drenched by the incessant fall of rain, we forded the river, immersed up to our hips and exposed at the same time to a heavy shower. This operation performed, we pushed forward at a hasty pace to the town not far distant from the bridge. Having here piled our arms, we returned to the stream to aid the artillery and hauled the guns safely across, notwithstanding the depth and rapidity of the current, now literally a torrent. Under the circumstances, this duty was excessively fatiguing and harassing, but the indefatigable zeal and anxiety which Captain Wilmot showed during the whole of the march to bring his guns and horses perfect into action, induced every individual willingly to come forward and put his shoulder to the wheel.